He's seen it on the socials.
What's up, YouTube? I want to remind you guys, smash that like button, give me a thumbs up, be sure to share it, and let's fight that algorithm. Now, on to the video.
Alright, welcome. I got my Wicca Phase shirt on. I just got back from our coven meeting. We had a Wiccan coven meeting in the Illuminati, and I still got dead baby in my teeth. I got to pick out the rest of the dead baby because, of course, I work for Dugan, who is my handler, D-U-G-A-N, and he is the head of the coven with me, the other Russian occultists, and Wicca Phase. So we're all in the same coven. And we're here to promote Putin, the dominance of Putin across the whole world, even though that makes up 0.0% of the stuff I talk about. We're here to talk about Genesis and creationism because we know all the Satanists and the occultists promote Genesis and creation and critique evolution. And we're here to defeat the atheists because, of course, the Satanists and the occultists are masters of doing that. Yeah, we get attacked every day, and banned, and do all kinds of crazy things happen because we are Duganists, and it's always people who can't even spell his name. So this image here is, you're going to say, now here's a little sneaky thing that the trads and the envious people do is they'll say, you haven't read so-and-so. You haven't read the fathers. You haven't even read this, that. And then when you show, because they're saying that you haven't, when you demonstrate that they have, the next thing they do is, oh, look at him, he's bragging. Oh, he's bragging, he's arrogant, he's bragging. This is just trickery. It's soy trickery, passive-aggressive trickery. And I'm putting this up to point out that I didn't come to the views that I've come to out of hand. Okay, I took it very serious. I've always taken these things very serious. I didn't come to these views purely out of intellectualism, as if I'm just sitting around and reading books, and it's not about, going to the liturgy, going to church, or taking any of these things seriously. I attended the Latin Mass for many, many years, so I took it very seriously. I still have all my Roman Catholic missals. They're all worn from use. Like it's not fake, right? It's not movie props. And I'm putting this up just to demonstrate that my whole trek from when I was in my 20s through the Church Fathers in terms of Roman Catholicism was patristic. Okay, so it wasn't that I came to Orthodoxy eventually, again, out of hand or rashly. And so a lot of the characterizations that are put up online are just mischaracterizations, and they're just trusting that people won't actually look and see what the history is, or that whether I've actually read the Church Fathers. So there you can see the 38 volumes of the Church Fathers set that I have, and they are largely read. Now, I have not read every piece of this giant set because a lot of these documents aren't even that relevant. A lot of them are, they're interesting historical pieces, but they're not that relevant. So, no, we're not going to read the entire set of the Church Fathers for a bunch of stuff that's not even relevant. But the ones that are relevant are the key patristic figures, right? Now, that set there is one of the few English sets, right? There's also the Catholic University set. I have a lot of volumes of that set, but that set is mega expensive. This set used to be $300, and so it was very accessible, and it's an Anglican translation. And there's many, many works beyond what you see there, obviously, that are in Ming, right? Patrologia Graeca, Patrologia Latina. So there's a lot more that goes into the Church Fathers, certainly. But I'm pointing this out because I want to hammer in on a few points and just stress that I know what I'm talking about, but that doesn't even make me necessarily, I'm not able to read, Latin. So I admit all that, sure. But I don't think that being able to read Latin or Greek necessarily means that a person can't understand the writings of the Church Fathers. Most people engaged in these discussions can't read the languages. And by the way, while the languages are a great skill, most of the people I've met who are fluent in language and linguistics, I'm talking about biblical linguistics, this is not true of everybody, but most of them, they're theologically illiterate. Like they don't know anything about the actual theological debates. They're very good with languages, and that's a great skill to have. I'm not knocking it. We've had great Church Fathers who were great linguists, St. Jerome, other people like that. And there's nothing wrong with possessing that skill, but it's like, I don't know, knowing a lot about science. I mean, it's only as good as the rest of the paradigm that you're working from. So I applaud all the great guys that are really talented in linguistics. In fact, we have some friends who we're going to be having on some streams in the future, some Orthodox apologists who are very fluent in language and also very fluent in theology as well. But we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses. And so one of my strengths is that, as I said, when I was a Calvinist, when I was a Protestant, my assumption was that we would find common ground with a lot of people in the early church, right? Well, I believe the Trinity, they believe the Trinity. I confess the Nicene Creed, they believe the Nicene Creed. That was my governing assumptions. And as I said, one of the first things that kind of got me going in this route was when I went to Boston Seminary, and I had a professor named Chris Strevel. He's now a Reformed Presbyterian minister somewhere. And we had a church history class. And the way that Boston Seminary worked was that it was very arduous. I had to read basically, I think, 10 or 11 books, somewhere in there, related to early and medieval church history, from and analyzing the church fathers. Well, I had at the same time, back in 2001, 2, 3, I bought this set. So I had the church fathers working with me, right, as I was doing this class. So I started reading Cyprian, I started reading Augustine, I read Ambrose, I read Jerome, started with the Latin fathers, got really deep into them, as we said many times. And immediately I had lists of questions, right? So I read the entire City of God, and I took these questions to different Protestant guys, including Chris Strevel. And, for example, in one conversation I had with Chris Strevel, he didn't know when St. Cyprian was even from. Like, he thought he was a 4th century, 5th century church father. And I'm like, you don't even know what time period St. Cyprian is, and you're going to try to tell me about. So immediately I was kind of like put off. And then the way that it usually works in the world of Calvinism is that if you bring real questions, you get ostracized, right? So you're not dealt with on a theological level. You're dealt with on more of a personal attack level, which is what we see a lot of the trads doing now, actually, which is ironic. So they're kind of they're kissing cousins, and it's a very easy transition from Calvinism to, as you said, to Thomism, if you read something like Arvin Voss's book comparing Thomas and Calvin. But the reason I say all this is to point out that this is my track, and this is why what I'm saying relates to what we're going to talk about today, which is that one of the great ways to dispel a lot of the just totally incorrect claims about Protestantism is to actually read the first millennium of the church. Now, you might think, well, okay, but that's not really going to do much against the Roman Catholics. That's where you are wrong. Because it's actually the deeper that you get into the first millennium of the church that we see that the modus operandi is absolutely not Vatican I. Why do I keep hammering home Vatican I? Because in Poster Aeternus and in the decrees of Vatican I, we have a expansive, clear as day, 10-page essay, you could say if you print it out, maybe 15 pages, the whole thing, telling you how Christianity is structured. The whole thing is structured on Peter, the office of the Pope, the successors to the Pope, on the See of Rome, and the charism of infallibility. The whole church is structured on that, very clearly, right? We covered all that when we did the streams against sedevacantism and the talks and debates against sedevacantism. But one of the first questions that arises is that if that's the case, then why do we see so many centuries and so many councils not actually operating that way? And at the time of Vatican I, there was a lot of theological dispute between people like Dullinger, people that were writing in the tradition of Cardinal Newman, pointing out how doctrine develops, right? And this was even at the time a controversial notion because Pascendi Dominici Gracious of Pius X had condemned the notion of doctrines evolving. At the same time as we're trying to defend this recently held Council of Vatican I, which had the idea, at least in its nascent form, that there is an evolution, so to speak, in some sense of dogma. Now, we don't believe there is an evolution of dogma. We would say that the councils, when the councils occur, they are clarifying, putting into clearer focus, explicating what's already true. And yes, terms might be used that are new. We'll see this with St. Basil. St. Basil did some what you could call liturgical innovations, but he did them for a very good reason, right? And so he had to actually argue in one of his letters that he was following the spirit of the law and not the letter of the law. And in fact, when we look in the first work that we're going to look at, which is one of his most famous works on the Holy Spirit, we'll see that he begins the treatise by rebuking the word concept fallacy, right? Something that you've heard us talk about many, many times, me and David and others, because the Roman Catholics and the Oriental Orthodox will consistently do the word concept fallacy. So it's not about whether I read enough to make this or that status of whatever. The point is that when you do read these guys in depth, and I'm not just talking about going back to the Church Fathers to quote mine for papal proof texts, right? Reading Vatican I into, the decisions of Nicaea or the canons of Nicaea. It's about understanding the context. And this is one of the problems that a lot of people, and this happened to me, so I can empathize with it, because when I was first looking at Orthodoxy, again, 2007, there was a limited amount of Orthodox apologetics online. There were some good people out there. I'm not knocking those people. But it was still very limited. There weren't a whole lot of Orthodox blogs or apologists out there, so it was very limited. And there wasn't a lot of resources. There weren't a lot of people addressing issues, as there are now, which is a great thing. We're getting more and more every day. In fact, that's my purpose of my Discord, is actually just to train. It just dropped into my lap. It is now a means to train people in Orthodox apologetics, which is a great thing. So what we're getting at is that this first millennium is the key clincher for actually most of these disputes, right? And to just assume, as I did as a Roman Catholic, to just assume, that first millennium is all settled. It doesn't really matter. The only relevance that I have with the Church Fathers of the first millennium is to go back and quote mine them to prove the papacy. But most Roman Catholics don't even know the doctrine of the papacy, right? They come to it and they think, the papacy is, the Pope decides ultimate disputes, and I don't have to believe anything that he says unless it's extraordinary magisterium. Now, we've refuted that many, many times over, that that's not actually what the doctrine of the papacy ultimately is. It's actually the foundation stone of the church. And there are very wide, expansive, and clear, grand claims about that office from Vatican I. And that's why I always hammer on Vatican I, because that's really the key to understanding it. And most Roman Catholics don't even line up with what Vatican I actually says about the papacy. Even the ones who think that they're traditional conservative Novus Ordo Catholics in communion with Francis. And the easiest way to demonstrate this is just to force them to look at the pre-Vatican II documents, right? The encyclicals prior to Vatican II. 10 books is a giant whole collection of the popes against the modern errors, which is encyclicals, right? I would recommend, if you're a Roman Catholic, go read that, because you'll see that clearly Vatican II is a departure from the pre-Vatican II church. So what becomes the norm for the Roman Catholic apologists, I did this for many years, was the mental gymnastics of trying to mesh these two things, the post-Vatican II church and the pre-Vatican II church, together. But let's cut all that out right now. We're not here to talk about trad stuff. We're going to talk about a different way of approaching these issues, which is to actually read the writings of the Church Fathers themselves. By the way, that's another mistake people make. I'm not saying it's wrong to read secondary scholars, but a lot of people who start getting into these topics, they just default to academics, like, I'm not going to jump into the Church Fathers. I'm going to read Dr. Professor so-and-so's analysis of St. Gregory of Nyssa's concept of person. Why don't you go read St. Gregory of Nyssa? You can read the Church Fathers, right? I'm not saying there's not difficult areas of the Church Fathers. Actually, Basil will cover that himself. He'll talk about difficulties in the Church Fathers, and he'll talk about the difficulty of studying theology, which is not a bad thing, by the way. But it's still, I think, a mistake. I've watched people over the years do this, where they have spent many, many hours, many, many years reading secondary people, and they've never actually read the primary source. So I just don't think you can replace the reading of the primary sources with a few secondary sources, that you read at seminary or that you found in some chat group or something like that, right? So again, we need to go to the primary sources, especially if we're going to be touching on the issues of Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And when we go to the primary sources, and this is what the Roman Catholics and the Calvinists don't do, and when they do, they get woke, is that we see that they don't teach either Roman Catholicism or Protestantism.